The first feeling that the idea of women in STEM evokes for me is it shouldn't matter. One of the things that attracts people to STEM is we're looking for a universal or a fundamental truth. We're looking for how things work. We're looking for how the world works. And we'd like to remove some of the power dynamics or the subjective, the politics of how the world works from really finding the truth. The fact that we're still talking about women in STEM shows that STEM as a fundamental subject is not sufficient to get at underlying truths. There are still power dynamics. There are still gender discrepancies.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Blooming Late Scientists. I am very pleased to say that this week we have Shu Simon on the show. And Shu is Chief Operating Officer at Ezone. I hope I've pronounced that right. But just so I don't make any more silly mistakes, I'm going to hand straight over to you, Shu, to do an introduction of yourself. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Martina. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Shu Simon, and I am Chief Operating Officer at Ezone Technologies. Ezone is ozone spelled backwards, and this is a startup company that is making an ozone generator for antimicrobials. So I have been a scientist for many, many years. I started out with a PhD in biophysical chemistry and molecular structure. And then I went through some government positions where I was working in anti-chemical weapons. And then I went back to get my MBA because one of the things that I discovered working with scientists and government officials at the same time is that scientists don't make as much sense to the government officials as we would expect to. So I went and I studied that. That got all explained. And then I've been in the startup space ever since.
Wow, that was a very nice, concise summary of your life. I guess I have a random question, actually, that always comes up. And it's just interesting because you said you've studied for an MBA and you're a scientist. And the one thing that people always ask is it worth doing an MBA if you're a scientist?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I think that we could spend the whole podcast talking about this. So the answer, as in many cases, or as the answer to many questions, is it depends. So I will say that it was worth it for me. And one of the things that I would like to do with my life is make it so just smooth the way so that it is not worth it to others. What I mean is it's expensive. Sure, it's expensive financially. It's expensive in terms of time. Many people will look at an MBA and think this is a common sense degree. Why do you need a degree in business when business is so fundamental to how we work? And I really needed that degree. I needed it explained to me. I think that there is a way to get it so that even scientists and everyone else who is going to have a job eventually understands the fundamentals of how business works without studying it specifically.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, actually, because I've had this conversation so many times. And as you say, we could go on and on about this thing. But I just thought I'd ask it because people will be interested to hear your answer to that, I think, in this space. But back to the subject in hand, women in science or women in STEM. So when I asked you to be a guest on the show, what was it that prompted you to do it, to say yes?
Well, the underlying answer of why I say yes is I met you and you are just absolutely delightful. So that is the underlying question is we do what makes us happy. A lot of times we're going to we try to quantify what it is that we do and why we do it, when in fact there's really something that's a little bit more internal. And so there's a connection there. But why was there that connection? I think the connection was there because you and I had some similar experiences as far as blooming late scientists. There were some things that we discovered later in life that might have just hit us over the head with how obvious it should have been decades or years before.
Yeah, I mean, for people listening, Shu and I had a long call before where we got totally passionate about the women in STEM subject and just connected on a different level. So it's a pleasure to have you here. So for you, the subject of women in STEM, what kind of feelings does that evoke for you?
The first feeling that the idea of women in STEM evokes for me is it shouldn't matter. One of the things that attracts people to STEM is we're looking for a universal or a fundamental truth. We're looking for how things work. We're looking for how the world works. And we'd like to remove some of the power dynamics or the subjective, the politics of how the world works from really finding the truth. The fact that we're still talking about women in STEM shows that STEM as a fundamental subject is not sufficient to get at underlying truths. There are still power dynamics. There are still gender discrepancies. There are still signals that people are sending out to the world that are either contradictory or non-productive or somehow distracting. I present very much as a femme. I look very feminine. And there is something to be said about I present one vision to the world. I present one message to the world about how feminine I am. And it's still difficult for some people to reconcile that with, I think, very quantitatively.
Why do you think that is?
I think that there is a lot of meaning making or pattern recognition that people will get. And so they will find patterns, they will seek patterns. There are certainly shortcuts. There are mental shortcuts to how people make sense of the world. And the shortcuts are generally good as far as surviving, as far as being productive. You don't necessarily have to be completely accurate to survive and thrive. In fact, my joke is always 80% is a B. So it's in some ways a good thing that we don't need to stop thinking until we're completely right, but we can make some of these assumptions. What I find interesting is when those assumptions aren't right, or when those assumptions don't fit with the way the actual world works, that's when we start getting arguments, and that's where we start getting misunderstandings, and that gets very interesting.
But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because all of this misunderstanding, so much of the world, and I know it happens outside of STEM, but we're here to talk about STEM in particular. So much of these things are almost invisible to certain groups of people. It's as if it's not really happening. Because, for example, the women in STEM subject, yes, I've said it a million times. I wish we didn't have to talk about this. I really do. But we're here and somebody's got to talk about it. So I'd rather it be me. But sometimes I talk to groups of people and they're always surprised to hear that this is still a problem. They're like, well, I don't see this. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that there are these dynamics and so many women are struggling in STEM, in the workplace, in university, in the education system. But to some groups, it's as if it's just not there. The problem doesn't exist.
Yes. Oh, there are so many things that brings up. So I will first agree that I wish this were not something that we were discussing, because I wish it were not a problem. That said, more important than not discussing something uncomfortable is fixing a problem. And so I'm absolutely happy to be here in that context. Some of what helps is I find a lot of problems get solved when they are articulated correctly. So what that means is once you frame the question in a way that the question makes sense and is accurate and correctly identifies the problem, the solution is much, much easier. One of the things that I think you're talking about is people who don't see the problem,
Yes.
So don't recognize the problem, or might recognize the problem but so wish it weren't there, or discount the problem, maybe recognize the problem but mix it in with other potential problems. What that does is it obscures the question. And I think that this is still a problem because we've recognized that there is a problem for a very long time, but the actual underlying problem, what needs to be solved, I don't think we've gotten there yet. And I think we can get there a lot faster when people recognize there is a problem.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Things are changing slowly. I spoke on a previous episode to somebody who said that from their perspective, the problem was not people, it was systems. And I think that's very, very true, actually. But of course, systems are made up of people. So somewhere there is a person involved. But we are seeing some changes. But from your perspective, during your career, what has it been like for you? I mean, you're in a position of senior leadership now. And of course, we don't see lots of women in senior leadership in biotech and STEM in general. So what's your experience been like?
Oh, I'm going to start by telling a story that's not exactly going to answer your question, but it's going to dance around it. And then I will answer the question of what my experience has been like. So my name is Shu Simon. And the reason that I say that is if you look up Shu Simon on the internet, you are going to find a lot of Asian men. To a certain extent, I can hide behind a name that is stereotypically masculine and Asian, and both of those are generally perceived as good at STEM. So if I have a resume and no picture, if I have something that is simply written down, the assumption is that I will be good at STEM. People tend to believe what my credentials are, and there's no question. So then when people find out that I am a Caucasian woman, there is this disconnect. And there was a moment that I had where I could see this disconnect, and very, very brightly. So about 20 years ago, I was organizing a conference and I was running all of the correspondence for this conference. It's important that it was about 20 years ago because this is before anybody's picture was attached to their email address. So I spoke to a lot of scientists. I made a lot of invitations. I made a lot of logistical arrangements with the name Shu Simon, so with an Asian man's name. It was so pervasive that, in fact, one of the scientists argued with me that I should go by Simon Shu because I'm in the United States and we put our family name last. I didn't bother to argue that I am the person who is in charge of my name. I just thanked him for the cultural reference and moved on. So then at this conference, a lot of people who knew me as an Asian man, or just their mental image was as an Asian man, came into the pre-conference social event. And one of my friends just had a great time walking me around to these groups of scientists and saying, "This is Shu Simon." And the reason that this was so fun is because you could see groups of people being confused all at once. So nobody thought I was incompetent. Nobody questioned me. They simply questioned their assumption. And when you're questioning an assumption, it distracts from what is actually happening. And so that's what my experience is. People tend to question my competence simply, not because I'm incompetent, simply because it's a question. And so I've always had to do a little bit more proof than some of my peers that I belong at the table, that I deserve to say something, I deserve to be heard. STEM helps with that a lot because STEM does have a lot of quantitative backing. Like there are numbers there. So it helps to maybe back away from some of that and point to the STEM. But then you do have to be very familiar with the data so that you can point it out when people have the question.
Wow. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? That I mean, I can see one, let's go to the start of that. I can kind of see where people would get confused about the name, if I'm honest. But yeah, I can just imagine their faces. I wish I was a fly on the wall when that happened.
It was really fun. I wish I had a video.
But also, you just described this idea that you felt you've had to work a little bit harder to kind of prove yourself almost. I mean, what does that feel like to you that you have to do that?
Oh, it's exhausting. That's simply it. It's simply exhausting. It's exhausting and distracting. So I feel like my mind is going in more directions than I want it to. So if I could focus on the task at hand, I feel like the progress would be a lot faster than if I were focusing on the task at hand and also how my contribution to that task is perceived.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's such a waste of time, isn't it? Having to constantly justify your presence somewhere, or why why you're doing something, or why you belong somewhere. It's just a waste of time. Like if we could get past that, like you say, and focus on the task in hand, everything would be so much more productive.
Yes, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of resources all around.
Yeah, for sure. So, how have you found now that you're obviously COO of a company, and from that perspective, there, what's your experience been like as a woman in senior leadership?
Oh, so that's an excellent question. Most of my professional experience, or a lot of my professional experience, has been under female leadership. So I have worked with women. That might have something to do with who's going to hire me in the first place, somebody who sees my competence without questioning it quite as much as some others. And that's certainly not universally the case. It's just many, many of my immediate supervisors have been women. So for me, that is a little bit of a way of I have been able to see senior leaders who were women. And so I saw good examples and I was able to follow those good examples.
So, role models almost.
Role models. I was very lucky with role models.
We talk about this so much on the show, how important it is for people to have role models and to see people like them in positions that they might aspire to be in. I think we underestimate just how important that is for us. For example, like when I did my PhD, I talk about this a lot. I had young children and I found it really tough. And if I'm honest, I think I kind of left the academic research system because I couldn't see anybody like that. And I just thought, do you know what? I'm just not going to fit here. I'm so different to all these people in every way. And if I'd have seen people like that had different backgrounds, that had a family, I possibly might have stayed in the system for a bit longer. But it's so important that we see people like that, isn't it?
It is. It is absolutely. Once you see an example, it is so much easier to recreate that example.
Yeah. Yeah. There is this idea that we should forge our own paths. And I am a believer that we should forge our own paths. But actually, it's helpful if you can see a path that's already been taken. And you can forge your own path to that destination. That's what I like to think. But it's so much easier if you can see it carved out in front of you.
Yes, and this has many, many applications aside from STEM and careers. I live right next to a forest, and there are paths in the forest. There are also ways to bushwhack through the forest. If you want to go on a hike, is there any benefit in being the one to create a path that people may or may not use, that may or may not get you to the destination? And then if it does get you to the destination, is going to take a lot more time and energy and do a lot more damage. It's the doing a lot more damage that really troubles me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think lots of people think like that, like you just described. Actually, in science, it's very prevalent where we have this idea that we should beat through the forest because that's what makes you a great scientist, right? The beating down, the trees, but actually you've just described that you can cause so much more damage. And on top of that, I mean, my personal perspective, and I understand this is just mine, is that those things aren't what make you a scientist. For me, it's about the ability to think creatively and logically all at once and know that if there is a quicker way to get from A to B without causing all that damage, that's what you do.
Yes, I absolutely agree. In terms of education, a very good education will incorporate what somebody has, the knowledge, the skills they have already, correctly identify the next thing that they need to make progress, and then allow them to get that next thing that they need. And so that is the way a quality education works. That is the way to really create a good scientist, to create somebody who has gone through the education system successfully. And with somebody else leading, with a highly qualified educator leading the path, or having created the path, or knowing enough about the forest to know, how to guide or how to get people off of the off-path systems. That's what really creates a good scientist.
Yeah, so that's, that includes other people as well, which often we forget, isn't it? It's that support system. Do you think we have that?
Oh, I think we have a start. I think it can improve a lot.
Yeah.
So I will admit, if I were to go to school again, which I don't feel like doing, I would study education, because I do think that there is something very interesting about the system, the educational system, that purports to prepare people for careers. And yet, at least the university system in the US is almost entirely divorced from industry. And so there is some disconnect there that I think can be fixed.
Yeah. So this is a fascinating topic, because I've had this discussion with so many people where we talk about this disconnect, but also the idea that by connecting fully to industry, would we lose the kind of curiosity aspect that we have in universities? For example, in academic research, it's much more about curiosity. Let me try this, let me change that. When you move into industry, it's much more focused, which of course both are beneficial. So somewhere along the line, there must be a balance of some kind. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that both are beneficial. I think in most cases, in solving almost any problem, having multiple points of view, having multiple assumptions will help solve the problem, not necessarily in the most efficient way, but in the superior way. So it will create a superior solution to have multiple points of view. What troubles me is when there are silos that are disconnected from each other, that are almost prevented from communicating. And at least when I was going through university 25 years ago, there was an assumption that university professors who have any industry experience were unfocused and therefore unqualified. Whereas I think any industry experience, anything that expands the horizons, can help them communicate or help them connect with students who are not necessarily going into academia, who might be going into industry. So it can help them connect with students and what they need versus what the university thinks the protocol is.
Yeah, it's almost like having, and I mean, I hate to say it like this, but I'm going to refer to outside of academic research as real world, which I know is not the right thing to say, but I'm just thinking outside of academic research. I often think, like you, if educators and lecturers had left and done something else in industry, or just something completely different, and then come back to education, the whole way they would deliver their teaching would be completely different and very beneficial for students.
I can recommend a book that talks about this quite a bit. So yes, Martina, you and I have talked about books quite a bit. So this book is by David Epstein, Range. And the book is about late blooming, non-scientists, but late blooming professionals, and the idea that people who have a variety of experience, so a breadth of experience, may not be very successful very early in life. However, they can draw on that experience to become successful later in life. And in fact, it is the breadth of that experience that gives them the creativity, that gives them the courage, that gives them the context to be very successful once they put all of those elements together.
Oh, that's really interesting. And you say it's called Range?
It's called Range.
Right. Okay. Yes. Because actually, talking of books, now you've got me on the subject, is I did want you to highlight, because we spoke about another book that, I've downloaded it to my Kindle and done the hard work. I haven't read it yet. But we were talking about that was really intriguing, that I think lots of people listening to this will want to read. So could you talk a bit about that book?
Yes, this is a book by Kate Guzernicki, and it's called The Exceptions. This book came to me because it is about struggles at MIT specifically with women in science. And it's Nancy Hopkins. Nancy Hopkins is very famous for having led a lot of the progress of women at MIT. And the reason that this is important to me is because I did get my PhD at MIT, and I started in 1999. And so 1999 was the year the report on women in science came out. So before 1999, there was a great deal of essentially clandestine research. The women at MIT, each individually thought something is wrong. Why am I struggling so much more than my colleagues are? And it's very easy for people in that situation to think, am I simply not competent enough? It's very, very easy to internalize that blame. Once the women got together and really looked at it scientifically, numerically, and were able to write a report about how this is a systematic problem, then it was much easier for male colleagues to recognize this as a problem as well. What struck me about the book is that all of the plot, everything that happened before 1999, before I got there. And when I got there, the prevailing message was, we have correctly identified the problem. It is no longer going to be a problem. It is the right time to be a woman in science. And yet, when I was going through this book with things that had happened 30 years prior and like all the way up to 1999, it paralleled my experience exactly. So when we were talking about it is much easier to solve a problem once it's correctly articulated, that is true. The danger here is simply because it's articulated does not mean it's solved. I think we still need some curiosity. I think we still need some observation about, is the problem actually solved? Have we asked the correct question? What else are we not thinking about?
I mean, yeah, so much, so much we could talk about there. But I mean, we had this discussion before, but you've just hit the nail on the head, because this facade of just saying what the problem is and saying, yes, there is a problem, seems to be such a big thing. And like you say, just saying that the problem exists isn't enough. It doesn't just go away because you've identified it. That is important. But then what are we going to do from then on? We can't, we see it so much, in government. We see it in all different walks of life where people just say, yeah, it's a really big problem. Women in STEM, they don't get, in leadership, it's really difficult. And then nothing really happens. So it's so important that we have a process in place or something that helps move on from just identifying that. But how do you think we get to that point?
I think STEM can help a lot. So step one is correctly identifying the problem. And that takes a lot of editing. It's not a trivial step. And then once a problem is identified, people tend to think, there is an easy solution. And sometimes the solution is easy. But then once there's a solution, that solution has to be implemented. And when that solution gets implemented, sometimes there are unforeseen consequences. Sometimes it doesn't actually solve the problem because the question wasn't articulated perfectly in the first place. So as long as there is some curiosity, and you were talking about curiosity and the importance of curiosity, as long as there is some curiosity about the improvement process, as long as there's some measurement, as long as there's some visibility, some transparency, we are going through this process. We are trying to solve the problem. Is the problem actually being solved? And I think that the most important thing is for the answer to that question, for it to be okay for the answer to that question to be no. If the problem is not being solved, we need permission to step back and work on actually solving the problem at whatever step of the process we need.
Yeah, so it's a very scientific approach, what you've just described, isn't it? The whole process.
In the best possible sense, yes. And I think that in the best parts of science, if you're asking a question, no should be an acceptable answer because you're simply asking a question. In practice, we need jobs, we need to make money. Sometimes no is not an answer, not an acceptable answer, and that becomes a conflict of interest, and that's interesting in its own way as well.
Yeah. Well, people are also afraid of the answer no, aren't they?
Yes.
Very afraid. which doesn't help.
Yes. Yeah. I wish no were a more acceptable answer in more contexts.
Yes, me too. My goal for this year is to say no to more things.
Oh, that's a great goal.
That's my one and only goal.
You know what? I will admit to my New Year's resolution being related to that goal. And my goal is I am going to throw away trash.
Oh, okay.
When I see
As in,
trash,
yeah.
I'm not going to say, oh, I'll deal with this later, or maybe I'll use this for something, or I've got to find a place for it. No, it's trash. It needs to move out of my life.
Do you know what? I think I could benefit from that as well, but I'm not sure I'm ready.
It's the same thought process. I'm looking at this thing. I do not have to accept it. I'm looking at this answer. I'm looking at this goal. Just because it's there doesn't mean I need to accept it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Going back to this discussion we've just had about the scientific process. So when we actually do science and do the research, one of the biggest issues that we have and we see that people don't like to admit is often not things like, oh, we haven't analysed our data correctly. It's that you didn't collect the data correctly in the first place. So you can analyse it until the cows come home. Nothing's happening with it. So interestingly, when we apply that to this situation, I wonder if it's a very similar thing. You know, if we don't look to the right places to collect the information we need, then of course we're going to end up down the wrong road. So how can we apply that to this process to ensure we find out what really needs to happen?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I will echo that it is very uncomfortable to realize that you have to backtrack more than you want to.
Yes.
And sometimes that's just going to give you the superior result. Sometimes that's part of the learning process. The oops, I made a mistake way upstream of where I wish I had made this mistake. And so that's usually a very heavy load. It's a very heavy fix. And if I'm going to put on my chemistry hat, I think of this in terms of there's an energy barrier. So sometimes there's an energy barrier to starting a chemical reaction. So there are two reactive chemicals. They're right next to each other. They see each other. They know that they're going to come to a more stable conformation if they react, but they're not necessarily going to do that until there's enough energy to put into the system to get them to react. And I think that my life just does that all the time. I know that I'm going to be happier if I fix the root problem, but man, does it take a lot of energy to get to the root problem. And so I will acknowledge the energy barrier aspect of that. Some of it is, it might feel unsafe to have to start over. So what can we do to create safety nets? So some of it is checks and balances. Some of it is that transparency, getting more brains involved in the process, more ideas. One of the other things that I do with my life is I motorcycle. And there is an idea in the motorcycling world that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. If you want to go fast on your motorcycle, you don't just turn the throttle and hope for the best. You figure out the process, you slow down, you think about it, you analyze it, and then when everything is correct, that's when you can turn the throttle and go fast. So that's motorcycling is life sometimes.
Yeah, I absolutely love that analogy. I mean, I am very guilty of just getting on the bike and throttling the hell out of it. But as I've got older, actually, I'm learning to slow down, to speed up. But yeah, I think I was just very impatient in my younger years, and it's taken a while for me to get out of that. But so thinking about where you are now, you described that you'd had like female role models. So would you say that mentorship has been very important to you in this journey?
Yes, I think that mentorship has been very important. And I will also say that good mentorship and less good mentorship have been almost equally important. So good mentorship gets me where I want, in the way that I want, and in a way that feels good. Mentorship that hasn't gotten me those things has at least opened my eyes to, there are other possibilities. What is my role in this? What is my capability in this? And then it's caused me to be creative. It caused me to do a little bit of the bushwhacking and building some of that muscle myself. So it's a little bit of both.
That's really interesting. And I guess my follow-on question from that is then, how do you, I mean, of course, having the wrong one has been a benefit to you because it's been a lesson along the way. But some people will say, well, how do I minimize the chance that I won't get the right one? How do I find the right mentor for me?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And I do have some thoughts about that. So my first thought is it's very unlikely that there is going to be the right mentor, especially in academic STEM fields. There are multiple variables at play. Is the research topic what you want? And also, is the pedagogical system something that works for you? So both of those are two different things, and one can be great and the other one just not a good fit. And so how important is each one to you? The thing that I would like people who are looking for mentors to think about is I like the word champion instead of mentor. And the reason that I think about this is a mentor is somebody who has been through the process and who can give advice and who can see where you are and tell you what needs to be different in you. That can be very exhausting. And many times people will say that women are under-mentored. And I say, no, women are full of the world of people who want to tell them what to do. What I think women are under is I think women are under-championed. So a champion is somebody who sees your potential, has the breadth of perspective, has the network, has the resources to put you in a position where you can not only grow, but also shine. And it is that shining that is very good for careers. So having high visibility, high impact, high competence projects. So I will ask people to look for champions. And the champion doesn't necessarily have to be the mentor, doesn't necessarily have to be the graduate advisor, but having somebody there who sees your potential and can place you well, that is key.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And I have to say, as somebody who spent years avoiding having a mentor, because I was like, well, I just don't want to be told what to do. I'll just do what I want to do. And then going from that to actually, maturing. And I'm not really selling myself on this show, I realize, but I've had mentors now. And I have to say, they've been, without sounding naff, they've been life-changing, some of them. But I will say that the thing that I really had to have at the time was mental availability to actually have mentoring. And I often wonder if that's where some of the disconnect lies as well.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So a lot of the way I think about the world and people is I think about them in terms of molecules. And this time I'm going to talk about biology instead of chemistry. So in biology, we have signaling molecules.
Yes.
So hormones, and then we have receptors. So things that bind to those hormones and then cause whatever cascade of events that makes the actual change. If you don't have the signaling molecule, you won't have the change. But if you have the signaling molecule, so in this case, it's the mentor, if you have the person telling you what to do, but you don't have the receptor, you don't have the ability to really absorb that message, the change still won't come. Both of them have to fit.
Yeah, again, great analogy. But I think that's so important because it's not just about who we find, it's about the timing for us, isn't it?
Yes, very much.
That's key.
Yeah, many things have to align correctly.
Yeah. The one thing I wanted to ask you actually that I thought about after we last spoke is from your time at MIT, and you said that was 99?
Yes.
How do you think things have progressed for women in STEM to this point now?
On the one hand, they may not have progressed as much as I would like because we're still talking about it. It's still interesting. On the other hand, there have been so many more women going through the pipeline. So one of the things that we had thought about in '99 about women in STEM is we thought women weren't interested in STEM at the outset. Women weren't studying STEM. They weren't starting with STEM majors. We were losing women in STEM, like at the high school or at the junior high school level, because women simply weren't interested. So we thought that if we start at the very beginning and get women going through the pipeline, then they will stay through the pipeline, that they will keep progressing. And we tried that. That was a very long-standing experiment. And what we found was young women can be very interested in science. Once they get that energy barrier, once they see that it is not sufficient to be interested in STEM, but you also have to be not only competent, but seen as competent, which are two different things. See opportunities for yourself, get the opportunities, and have some reason to stay. So it looked like people were leaving the pipeline in '99. They were leaving somewhere before the top end. Now, I think we are seeing more and more people staying at the top end of the pipeline. Does that mean the problem is solved? No. But it does mean that there are at least more people who have bushwhacked their way and there are more potential paths available.
I always love this. I love the way you explain things, I have to say. It's really, really brilliant, and I just love it. But I wonder if by these people, bushwhacking their way through, as you describe, eventually there will be, you hope there will be this kind of exponential bushwhackery of other people coming through and following that. That's what you would hope for, isn't it?
I would hope for that. There's also something to be said for once there are enough women at the top, are they listened to? Are their ideas valued? And I do think that successful women have different attributes than successful men, because women who have masculine attributes, women who come across as brusque, there's that disconnect too. And so they are socially ostracized or socially punished for having male attributes. So what I think is going to happen is there's going to be a broader tool set of what is available for good, effective leadership. And that I think is good news.
Yeah, that is good news. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you just described is, are women listened to at that level? Not always, because there's also a disconnect between the amount of funding women get in STEM industries, right, for businesses.
Yes.
So true. That you would assume there's still issues there in how we're being listened to or perceived in some way.
Yes, very much so. And I will also say that as far as funding goes, so if you're looking for successful companies, there are many, many metrics for successful companies, but companies that are led by women tend to statistically do better than companies that are led by men. And you can look at this and you can have any interpretation you want, and people are going to say, women are better leaders than men, and so we should just put a bunch of women in it. That may not be precisely true. What may be true is the women who have made it to leadership have gone through more stringent filters than the men on average who have made it to leadership. And so if there is a higher bar for the women and you're just looking through at the women who have cleared this bar, then already there is some filtering that's going on. And so you can focus a lot on the successful women and get a very good return. I am going to flip this on its head and talk about a different industry that is female dominated. And this is the childcare industry. And I will fully admit that when I was looking for a nanny, I went through a service and I had an infant. In order to be a female nanny in this service, in this placement service, for infants, you needed 200 hours of experience. In order to be a male nanny, you needed to have 1,000 hours of experience. So when I looked at all of the applicants, I could choose from 30,000 women or 9 men? I didn't have a lot of time. I looked at the 9 men and I had 1 man who I hired and was amazing. So somebody had done the filtering for me. Is this fair? Absolutely not. But did it work out in my favor? For once, yes, gender discrimination worked out in my favor.
That's fascinating. I mean, how can you even, I mean, I just don't know how we're even going to answer that, but how can you even get away with doing that?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. I don't know.
I mean, that's actually bonkers.
Ask a regulatory specialist in the US. Who knows?
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow. Oh my goodness. Do you know what? I have to say, we have to stop here because otherwise we are going to talk for hours. And the problem with podcasts is people won't listen for hours. But I could talk to you, I think, for just months and months and months because there's so much we could talk about and dig into.
Likewise.
I think we need a part 2.
Sign me up.
A final question I have for you is, what kind of advice would you give to young women trying to make their way, into STEM subjects, moving through the process? What advice do you have for them?
I will give a piece of advice for the demographic you said, but also this is just a little bit more broad for women or underrepresented minorities of any ilk. And that is when you are listening to advice, like the advice that I'm giving, check to see whether it is a protocol that somebody thinks has worked for them, or whether it is somebody who knows you, sees you, knows what you need, and has given that. So are you at all part of the advice? And if not, throw it away.
That's brilliant advice. Absolutely brilliant. I think you should write a book, if I'm honest.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
You must have time as COO. Come on.
Tons of it.
That is such great advice because I think that's something we don't do. I wouldn't have even thought of doing that.
Right. I have wasted a lot of mental energy thinking that I was wrong because somebody told me I was wrong when in fact they simply weren't seeing my world.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Thank you so much, Shu, for being on this. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on here. I loved our first conversation. I love this, and I hope we will stay in touch because you're brilliant.
Absolutely.
And I know this episode people are going to absolutely love to listen to. Thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And to everybody else, we'll see you next week for another episode of the Blooming Late Scientists.